plans by the Buhari administration to borrow another 600 billion naira from external sources has been causing ripples among Nigerians. We are quick to connect that with information within the past week that any incoming government would have an external debt burden of more than 77 trillion naira to contend with. For a government that speaks a lot about securing the future of Nigeria's young, the seemingly uncontrolled taste for external borrowing is being called a deliberate attempt at mortgaging the future of the same set of people. Adio is National Publicity Secretary of Youth Party of Nigeria. He joins us now to discuss this matter as well as government's approach to the COVID situation in China. It's good to have you with us, Ayodele.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, let's start with the COVID issue. I think your party recently issued a statement demanding the federal government restricts travel from China. Why do you consider this an issue currently?
I think it's a sensible thing to do. 13 countries, as I speak now, have restricted travel from China. And you know that Nigeria does a lot of business with China. A lot of trade happens between both countries. There's an independent report from an Australian think tank that has argued that there are at least 9,000 deaths a day in China as we speak, and that by the end of December, about 100,000 would have been dead and 18 million people infected. So it looks that the resurgence of COVID in China might likely force another global pandemic if countries do not take the necessary measures to prevent that catastrophe. And that's why we have argued that the federal government needs to act very decisively to, at the very least, ensure that testing are done for people coming in from China to ensure that they come in with a negative result before they are allowed to proceed into the country. So some form of travel restriction has to happen so that we do not wake up with another pandemic in our hands, because the truth is, I am not sure that lessons have been learned from the last pandemic. Many would argue that we escaped by an act of God and not necessarily, by brilliant national health policy. We haven't increased bed capacity. I'm not sure that we've increased that capacity to test at a national scale. We have not vaccinated enough. So I think it would be almost suicidal if we do not take proactive steps, because the truth is, if you're going to carry COVID into another country, it will be a variant because it would have mutated, and we're not sure if we are likely to be resistant to whatever mutation has occurred. So I think it's just common sense. It's a sensible thing to do to ensure that travel restrictions are put in place to protect citizens, and plan for the inevitable. All right. With every time that ticks, we're getting more vulnerable.
But do governments, now let me just broaden this, not just talk about Nigeria alone. Do governments in Africa, do they have that much willpower to be able to do this, understanding how much dependent Africa is to China and the repercussions that will follow if they decide to do that, understanding that, because I've just been looking at the list, save Morocco. And we know why Morocco always falls in this particular list, because they guard their tourism sector with all their lives, because that is almost their bread and butter. Save Morocco, that are not heavily dependent on China. The rest of Africa almost are dependent on China. And so countries like South Africa, Kenya, and the rest of them are not taking this particular route. It will almost be suicidal economically if we decide to do that.
So you don't have to do an outright ban of travel from China into Nigeria. That's not what we're proposing. Our argument is there has to just be some level of restrictions to ensure that at the very least, the people coming in are properly tracked. We have to ensure that they come with negative test results before they are allowed into the economy or into the Nigerian space. And that's the very least that should happen. We cannot, like you rightfully said, afford a situation that is going to endanger trade between us and China. And the consequences you have highlighted are quite reasonable. But the truth is, at the end of the day, we have to protect millions and millions of citizens, because we don't have the capacity to respond to a global pandemic. And the easiest thing to do is to ensure that we track, we trace, and we test people coming in from China to ensure that at the very least the people going into the country are negative and they are not carrying the virus with them.
And hopefully this won't hinder any diplomatic route between both countries, like he said. There's much dependence on trade and all that as well. Yeah. So let's talk about Nigeria's economy right now. And this issue about, or consideration of a 600 billion naira worth of borrowing proposal. So what alternative does your party recommend? And we're talking about an incoming administration after the polls. Wouldn't this be more of a burden? You're trying to borrow this now and at this hour.
Listen, debt burden is it's a Peruvian necktie on our economy. It's strangulating us, and it could lead to greater economic challenges in the near future if not properly addressed. The reality is, if you look at the budget that is about to be passed, right, 21 trillion, 9 trillion revenue, about over 12 trillion is going to be the budget deficit, which is likely going to be financed by debt. So we're at a critical point in our country where, in fact, in 2021, I think about 91% of our revenue went into servicing debts. Now, we can't run a country like that, especially when these debts are channeled at funding consumption. Because there's no problem with borrowing in itself. The problem is what you do with the funds that are borrowed. If you are investing those funds in the productive sectors of the economy, that will lead to greater economic growth, economic activities that the government can then tax and retrieve incomes back, it would be better. But at the moment, we are funding consumption. We are paying for politicians who drive in convoys of 20 SUVs, foiling these 20 SUVs. They are flying across the country to hold birthday parties. They are flying girlfriends on first class to Dubai. We can't fund all of these things as a country. So the government in itself has to be frugal, because on the one hand, while there is a debt problem, there's also a revenue crisis. And we have a revenue crisis because, first, we're not taxing our citizens enough. Our revenue to GDP, our tax to GDP ratio is one of the lowest in Africa and lowest in the world. And the reason you can't tax is because trust is broken between the citizens and the government. You can't be taxing me to fund your SUVs and your ostentatious lifestyles. It is not going to happen. So we have to start by increasing revenue. We need a bold revenue plan to begin to generate as much revenue as possible.
Well, we've been talking about diversification for a long time now, because the bold plan, is be more or less rhetorics rather than a call to action.
So listen, the reason why it is rhetorics is because the people in charge of government are not being transparent and are not being accountable. If you are a citizen and you hear that your accountant general is returning tens of billions of naira, how do you fall off your stool in your sitting room? It makes absolutely no sense. On the one hand, they tell you they don't have enough money to run the economy, to fund education. But on the other hand, high civil servants and politicians are stealing tens and tens of billions. They are spending monies on white elephant projects that don't add value on the average Nigerian, right? So we have to call a spade what it is. We have a revenue crisis, and to grow that revenue, we have to first double our tax to GDP ratio. And to double our tax to GDP ratio, government must first be accountable and be frugal. And to say that if I'm going to tax citizens, I also have to cut on the excesses that I am running now, which means I no longer need to travel on 20 SUVs. Government officials no longer need to fly first class or private jets.
Well, is that going to be enough? Understanding that every government seems to be kicking the can down the road.
Yes.
Refusing to be the one to carry that, or being the one saddled with that burden to bring in these reforms that will cost initial hardship before external gains.
Yes.
So the question now is this. No one wants to be a pariah. No government wants to be that particular government, because this will not just happen in 4 years.
Yes.
Some estimate that it will go more than 2 administrations.
Yes.
So looking at that closely, if you are a sensible government, as some political analysts are actually looking at it, they'll say that why let it be my problem when we can easily just try to stabilize the economy and try to move on, rather than probably trying to go through the hard route, which will benefit us all, but ultimately put us in the bad books.
You see, kicking the can down the road is what has brought us to this catastrophic mess that we're about to experience. There's a report from the IMF that says that by 2025, we'll be paying about 10 trillion in debt servicing alone. 10 trillion. 2025 is 2 years from now, right? As I'm speaking to you, our debt moved, domestic debt alone moved from 8 trillion in 2015 to over 21 trillion in less than 7 years. Foreign debt has moved also in that regard. Mind you, the federal government has gone to the National Assembly to say that the National Assembly, it wants to, securitize the 22 trillion naira that it has collected illegally from the CBN, first of all, because the CBN had breached that act for consistently borrowing to the federal government when the federal government above the 5% threshold of revenue that it should allow to borrow to federal government. So it has breached that act consistently. And now the federal government turns around and says that we want these monies to be paid in 40 years at 9% interest rate. Who is going to pay for that? It's citizens like you and I. And what the argument is that it is going to add 2.5 trillion every year to our debt servicing.
No, but
so it makes no sense. So
dimension it to the average man on the street.
Yes.
The street sellers, the market women, and all the people that all these numbers will just literally fly over their head. All they want to see is that there is constant light. There is availability of power. Yes, there is enough fuel to be able to move around and to be able to get their goods and services from point A to point B. How do you sell this to people that all they care about is what is before them and not these big numbers that they might never understand and they might never even get close to?
I think sometimes we don't appreciate the level of native intelligence that our people have, because many of them understand what it means to be fiscally irresponsible and to be irresponsible with public finances. I think market women understand that. I think transport association people understand that. I think artisans understand what it means to be irresponsible with public finance. Now, as a political party, for instance, and that's our job and that's our role as an opposition, and that's why we're making this point very vociferously, that the debt burden and the way that it's being and the way we're running our economy is leading us to the Golgotha. It makes absolutely no sense that 80 to 90% of your revenue is going on servicing debt. And to the people on the streets you talk about, the reason why they can't have decent public schools is because the federal government is funding consumption with its debt. The reason that they can't have potable water, the reason they can't have electricity, the reason that the economy is not working for the common man on the street is because we are not investing in productive sector. We're not investing enough in healthcare. We're not investing enough in education. We're not investing enough in infrastructural development, because we've spent in the last 7 years over 10 trillion on subsidizing petrol. For goodness sake, 10 trillion on subsidizing petrol. What kind of irresponsible economic policy is this? You're spending 10 trillion to subsidize petrol. We're spending over 10 trillion in that same period on public debt. Our revenue is shrinking by the day because there's a break of trust between the government and the citizens. So something has to give. And for us, our argument is that at the very least, government must come and say that I am broke and stop living like Uncle Jones. We don't have the money to fund these private jets that we have. We don't have the money to fund this ostentatious lifestyle that we're living. We can't fund all these MDAs who every time that they come into office, they are buying new cars for directors and they are buying new cars for the head of agencies. We can't fund all of these things. So if we have to tax you, we also have to show ourselves accountable to the people. And that's the beginning for us, at the very least, to double a tax to GDP ratio. We can choose to divest from government strategic investments to be able to get about a few billions of dollars here and there. But the key here is that we must grow the pie. We need sensible economic policies that grow the economy. I mean, the CBN that we keep talking about, we've made the argument. They are shrinking the economy at the moment because they are raising interest rates to deal with inflation. Our argument is simple. There's 133 million people who are out of jobs in our country. Poverty is on the rise. You are again raising rates, which means banks cannot borrow at favorable rates, which means the real sector cannot borrow monies to grow their businesses, to create more jobs. So at the end of the day, in fact, the inflation that you say you're even trying to tame continues to go up. So for goodness sake, we need sensible policies that encourage growth of the economy, that creates millions of jobs for young people, high-paying jobs that helps them move across the social ladder. And we need frugal economic policies where government is not spending on unnecessary white elephant projects and consumption. And then we can start to make progress as a country.
Very good. And on that note, hopefully you continue to drum this as an opposition and to those that are currently in power. Ayodele Adio, National Publicity Secretary, Youth Party. Many thanks for coming.